In this lecture, we will continue to talk about variables and data type and see what happens when we change the value of variables and also what happened to the data types. So this is how we left our code after the last lecture, but I don't want this code to get in my way right now. So I could just go ahead and delete it, but what I'm going to do is something very common in programming, and that's commenting out the code. So in JavaScript we have two ways of writing comments, and the single line comment is just / like this. And now we can, for example, describe what this code is about. And we can say lecture variables. And the second way of writing comments is multi-line comments, which is like this. So we first open the comment section, and then at the end we have to close it like this. So now all this code is commented, and if we continue writing something here, it will not be a comment. For example, like this. So you see this part is now gray, and this continues as regular code. So commenting is something useful, first to describe our code, and second to take out parts of the code that we don't want anymore, but that we also don't want to delete, which is the case here. So if we now refresh the browser, all of this should be gone because this part of the code here is not working. So let's see that. Alright, so let's continue with variables. So I'm actually going to add another comment here and describe what we're going to do. Lecture variables 2. So just to continue the variable lecture. Some space here. Okay, now I want to show you what happens when we mix together strings and numbers. So let's get back our variables that we had before. So I'm sure you know how to do that without even looking at the code from last lecture. So var name and the age. So let's print these two together in the console. Console.log. And the way we do this in JavaScript is with the plus sign. So name plus age. So in JavaScript the plus is not only to add numbers, but we can also add numbers and strings together. So let's see what happens when we do that. So I just refresh the browser, and we see this is a string which now has the string that we had before, John, and the 26 also as a string. So all of this is now a string. So why does it happen? So why does JavaScript transform our number to a string? And this is something called type coercion. So one of the things that dynamic typing that we just talked before in the last lecture does is that JavaScript automatically converts this number to a string. And this happens with other data types as well. So when we have different data types and we mix them together, JavaScript tries to automatically figure out which of the variables it has to convert and then converts them all to the same data type. So once again, this is called type coercion, and it just means that JavaScript converts some data types to another on the fly when it needs it. And of course this doesn't always happen, so if we would just write console.log age plus age, then it will simply add these numbers, and it would be not a string but a number. And in the console we see this with this blue color, so the blue outputs are always numbers, and the black ones here like this is a string. Alright, so let's now see another thing that we can do with JavaScript variable declarations, which is that we can just declare a variable and not define its value immediately. And we can even define more than one variable at a single line. And it goes like this. So we can define the person's job, or John's job, and create also a variable to define if he's married or not. So we could call this one is married. And that's just it. So we have two variables created, but we didn't assign them a value yet. And I'm sure that you remember from the last lecture what these values are assigned when they don't have a value yet. Do you remember that? So let's check it out. Console.log job. So try to guess what happens now in the output of this. Alright, undefined. So here it is. So remember that undefined is what gets assigned to a variable before its value is actually declared. And we can declare the value later. So let's do that right now. And when the variable is already declared, then we don't have to write var again, because the var keyword is only when we first declare the variable. So now we just have to write job, and then we can say something like teacher. And we can also define his married status, let's say, so let's married. So now I'm going to use this one as a boolean. So remember, boolean is a data type which can only accept true or false values. So let's say that John is not married yet. So let's log all of this to the console like we did before. So console.log. So we want the name. So we want to form a sentence now. So we need empty space. So as just a space. And in order to do that, we just write an empty string. An empty string, of course, with a space. So now plus age plus an empty space again plus job plus an empty space. Let me scroll down here, some more space, and then plus is married. So let's see what happens when we run this one. Okay, so once again we have type coercion here at work, right? Because all of this is now a string, and this one, so this is the isMarried variable, and this 26 is the age variable, and this one is a boolean, as you know, and this one is a number, and all of this was coerced or converted to a string. So type coercion did its work again and converted all of this to a string. So let's just make this a little bit more beautiful, the sentence. So John is in this case 26 years old teacher, right? Then we can ask a question, is he married? And then we just add a final period here. So if we reload this now, we have an error. Okay, uncaught syntax error. And this is great. So we have our first bug here. It wasn't on purpose, but it's great. So now we can try to first debug this little error. So what does the JavaScript console tell us? It says there's a missing parenthesis after the argument list. This usually isn't very useful, so we just have to figure out what's wrong here. So we have variable, and then plus, and then a sign, and then a string, plus, and then a variable, plus a string, and plus a variable, and so on, and so on. But what I see here is that here we don't have the plus, so we have a variable, and then just the string right after it. So we need this plus operator here in order to make the syntax correct. So in order to have correct code. So if we now refresh this, it should work. Alright, and now we have a beautiful sentence here. So John is a 26-year-old teacher. Is he married? False. Okay, so up until this point, all we did was define variables or declare variables and then just use it. But what we didn't do so far was to actually change the value of variables. And of course, that's something we can do, and we do it very usually, and it's one of the important aspects of variables. And changing the value of a variable is called variable mutation. So we can, for example, change the age to a string now, 36, for example. And we can also change the job to something else, like driver. So notice that once again, we didn't use the var keyword here because, as you know, the var keyword is only to declare the variables in the first time. It's the same thing as here. So we declared the variables here but didn't define a value for them, and then did it here, but we didn't use the var keyword again. And that's the same thing as we did down here. So let's now just copy this piece of code here to see what happens with the output. So let's refresh this once again. And now this is different. Let me actually get rid of these three outputs here. And what I can do once again, instead of deleting it so that I can give you the code later, I can just comment it out like this, and like this, and like this. And if I now refresh this, I will only have these two outputs that I want. So note that the first one is still the same that we had before. So John is 26 years old. Is he married? False. So this comes from this line of code here. And then we changed some of the variables. We mutated these variables. And now the sentence is different. It's John is a 36 years old driver. And then the rest is the same. What this means is that these changes only take effect in our code after we did these changes. So in the line before our changes, which is up here, we still see the old values. So the age and the job were first defined here, and then we used them in this line and read their values and printed them to the console. And then we changed their values and we printed them again, and then they were different. So what this means is that our code is read as a sequence from up here all the way down. So it's a sequence of instructions. And we will learn a whole lot more about this later in the course. But for now, just know that our code is read in a sequence of instructions from line to line. And that's the reason why the changes that we did here are only reflected in the lines after the changes and not in the lines before the changes, which would be here. Okay, just one more thing that I want to quickly show you about variables is something similar to console log, but instead of writing to the console, we want to get data from the console. And once again, these are not really meant to be used in production, so in the final application, but just when we are debugging some code or when we are doing simple examples like this. So if we want to get data from the console, then we just have to define a variable. Let's say we want to get the last name. And then we use prompt. And then we have a string. So in this case, let's say, what is the last name? So let's see what happens. All right, so now we get this pop-up window here with the string that we defined, what is the last name, and now we can put here something like Smith. And of course nothing happens because we didn't do anything with the variable. But if we do it like this, like we already know, then you can expect what's going to happen. So let's say Smith. All right, then down here we have the output of the variable that we just defined. So these are two functions that we can use for the console, and there's actually one more, which is simply the alert window, which is similar to the prompt, but it doesn't ask a question. So all we have to do is to use alert, and then let me just copy this from here so I don't have to write it all over again. So this will also basically print a value, but not to the console, but to its own pop-up window. But first we have this one here from this prompt instruction. So this doesn't really matter. Smith. And now we have one more bug here because it's not altered, it's of course alert. All right. So let's comment out this one so it doesn't get in our way. And this one as well. All right, so now we have it. John is a 36-year-old driver. Is he married? False. So this is the alert window that I was talking about. which I'm sure you have actually seen on some websites. So some websites just use this, but I think it's really more intended to debugging or to test something in an early stage of the development. Okay, so these are the basics of variables in data type and variable mutation. And so in the next lecture, we're going to move on to operators and see some details about operators like the plus operator that you already saw. And we're going to see some more about this. Okay, so see you there.